Dorothy Eady, a little girl who was 3 years old at the time, was playing all by herself, when suddenly she fell down from the stairs, hitting her head in the process and was knocked completely unconscious, lying helpless on the floor. Few minutes later, her parents found her but she wasn't breathing at the time. Out of worry and panic, they called a doctor who came over immediately as fast as he could. Dorothy's mother broke down in tears when the doctor said that there was nothing he could do, breaking the sad news to Dorothy's parents, that their little girl was dead. The doctor left the scene immediately after this. About an hour later, the doctor returned with Dorothy's death certificate. Then he gently began to discuss the burial arrangements and disposal for the little girl's body. During this serious conversation, strange noises was heard coming directly from Dorothy's room. They ran upstairs and they found Dorothy playing in her room, like nothing ever happened. Everyone was completely surprised and the doctor decided to examine her again, but there was no sign of injury on her and she was completely fine. The parents were likely furious at the doctor for pronouncing their little daughter dead without thorough evaluation, but the doctor swears she was actually dead. And that he had no explanation for what just happened. He said it appeared as if Dorothy had come back from the dead, although he didn't realize how right he was. Today's story is probably one of the most fascinating and interesting story about the cases of death and reincarnation, with a lot of skeptics trying to debunk it as false, although this story still stands the test of time. This is the fascinating story of Dorothy Eady, who is also known as Omseti. Welcome to the channel. Grab your popcorns and get ready because it's story time. Dorothy Eady was born in London in 1904, into a lower middle class family. She was the only child and she was absolutely adored by her parents. But unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she would have a strange encounter that will change the story of her life forever. And this encounter was falling down a flight of stairs in her home, where she was confirmed dead, and you already know the story. Until her near-death experience, or resurrection from the dead, where she fell down the stairs, Dorothy was just a normal little girl, but after the fall, she started having a series of strange encounters, like having night terrors. Her mother would wake her and Dorothy would tell her mother about the dream of her living in a huge columned building surrounded by trees and green gardens. It was always the same recurring dream, where she would be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she would be in this beautiful garden which she loved so much. She also talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable beautiful place, but she does not know where it was. Dorothy would tell her mother the same thing. She would usually say, "I want to go home," and whenever her mother told her that she is home, Dorothy would become totally frustrated and depressed. Sometimes, Dorothy's parents would find her pouting under the dining room table and they would ask what's wrong, and it was always the same answer. "I want to go home," and whenever she was asked where her home was, Dorothy would say she didn't know, but she just knew she wanted to get back there soon. Also, after the fall, Dorothy would develop a foreign accent syndrome where she would occasionally speak with a heavy foreign accent, and this was so unsettling that Dorothy's parents had trouble finding her a babysitter. By the time Dorothy was 4, her parents planned a day at the British Museum, but since they couldn't find anyone to watch after their daughter, they brought her along to the museum, and things got really strange as expected. 4-year-old Dorothy was bored in the museum. She dragged her feet, and she was acting like most 4-year-olds would act, but Dorothy's mood and demeanor drastically changed when they reached the Egyptian exhibit. Dorothy was totally dazzled by the artifacts, but when she saw the Egyptian statues, she immediately freed herself from her mother's grip and ran wildly through the halls of the museum. Dorothy was running out of full delight, from statue to statue, kissing their feet and yelling at people for wearing shoes in the presence of gods. Dorothy's mother was totally embarrassed and uncomfortable at her daughter's behavior, but then Dorothy suddenly stopped and became dead silent. Dorothy's parents found her in front of a glass case, in a frozen state, where she was staring at the face of an Egyptian mummy. Dorothy's mother picked her up, But she got upset with her mother, and in a voice that sounded like an old woman, Dorothy said to her mother, "These are my people." It would take Dorothy's parents a few hours to finally drag her out of the museum. Sometimes whenever the family had free time, they would go back to the Egyptian exhibit, because that was the only place where Dorothy felt happy and peaceful. By the time Dorothy was 7, her father bought her a children's encyclopedia about ancient Egypt, which Dorothy would spend hours studying hieroglyphics, with a magnifying glass. Her mother, out of deep curiosity, would ask what she was doing, and Dorothy would say that she's trying to remember her roots in her past. While she was reading a science magazine, Dorothy came across a picture of a temple built for the pharaoh, city father of Ramses the Great, in the town of Abenos. Dorothy was so confused that she asked her mother where all the trees were in all the green gardens, because they were missing in the picture, and she couldn't find them. Dorothy's mother asked her, "What is this place?" And Dorothy smiled a heartwarming smile that she ever had in her entire life, and pointed to the picture of Seti's temple in Abydos, and said, "Mama, this is my home, this is where I come from, and this is where I belong." Before we continue today's story, a huge shout out to our video's sponsor Gruns, which basically helps you in filling your nutrition gaps, giving you better nutrition tips and recommendations that will unlock your vibrant health and vitality. And since good health and nutrition is a basic necessity to everyone, Gruns will help you out. Make sure you give them a try, and you won't regret it. Link in bio. Death and reincarnation is one of those most controversial topics that we hear about, but sometimes they might be debunked, especially if there are no valid evidence to back up such claims, although there are many stories that supports this topic. Also, the history of children remembering their past lives that they have lived before is very common than most people think. There are several thousands of documented cases that parents report. There are certainly thousands more cases where the parents are too confused, or too embarrassed to report it. A very fascinating and interesting example was during the Battle of Iwo Jima, when the Japanese shot down American fighter pilot, James Houston Jr. He died in the cockpit of the plane on March 3, 1945. About 50 years later or more, James Leninger, a 2-year-old little boy, started having strange nightmares about being a fighter pilot crashing into the ocean, and dying in the process. When James was shown photos, he was able to name the kind of aircraft he flew. He knew the name of the aircraft carrier he was on. He could even name other men who served with him. All these information were given by James Leninger at 2 years old. And the shocking truth is that all this information was verified to be true. Another interesting story that explains the fascinating mystery of death and reincarnation happened in England in 1957, when 2 sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, aged 11 and 6, were killed when a car lost control and hopped the curb, leading to a fatal crash, taking their lives in the process. In 1958, a year later after the accident, the girls' mother, Florence Pollock, got pregnant and gave birth to twin girls, who were named Julian and Jennifer. Julian and Jennifer were identical twins, but they had different birthmarks. Jennifer had a birthmark on her waist that exactly matched a birthmark that Jacqueline had before she died. Such a great coincidence, but it didn't end there, because she also had a scar on her forehead, just like Jacqueline did when she was alive. By the time the twins were about 2 years old, they started asking for toys that belonged to their deceased sisters. The twin girls never saw the toys before, but they were attracted to it. Also, they would become completely terrified at moving cars, that they would begin screaming whenever they see any moving car, because they were having the notion that the car is coming to hit them. There are more and more interesting stories around this topic, with the coincidences going on and on. As for the case of Dorothy Eady, as she grew older, her memories became more clear and valid, and it was just a matter of time before Dorothy Eady would find out who she really was 3,000 years ago. That was 3 millennial quite a long stretch of time. This story is about to get more interesting. Dorothy Eady was very outspoken about her reincarnation, and she spoke about it openly and carefree. She was never worried about what anybody would think. Because she was clearly sure of everything she was saying, she was talking about his true life past experiences and encounters, although on the other hand, this did not sit well, and was a problem for a teenage girl of her age. In the 1920s, her parents would tolerate what they thought that was just an eccentricity, but other people were not so forgiving or welcoming, because Dorothy had become so completely obsessed with the cultures, traditions, religion and more of the ancient Egypt, and her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in a hell lot of trouble. On a bright Sunday afternoon, a Catholic priest showed up at the Eady's door. The priest said that Dorothy was no longer welcome to attend Sunday school, because she had refused to sing a hymn that spoke poorly about Egypt, but the final blow was when Dorothy argued with the Sunday school teacher, where she clearly stated that Christianity was based on the old religion of Egypt, and she would go on to compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. So basically she got expelled from her Catholic school, because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way dishonored the ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. When Dorothy was 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to develop a keen interest in the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but that she had forgotten how to read it. When Dorothy was 7 years old, she was looking through a textbook, and she saw a picture of the temple of Pharaoh Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt, and as soon as she saw the picture, which was a big picture of the temple, and then next to the broken remains of what looks like a garden, she immediately said, "That is my home and that's where I'm from." Also in the textbook was the picture of the Pharaoh Seti I, who the temple was named after, and when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome with shock, and she was surprised because she claimed to have known him personally, from somewhere or someplace. By the age of 10, Dorothy had been spending so much time in the British Museum, that world-renowned Egyptologist Sir E. A. Wallace Budge got to know her, and started teaching her how to read hieroglyphics, and unsurprisingly she picked it up very quickly, super quickly. Throughout all this time, Dorothy's dreams still continued, although by now, she already knew what was happening to her, and possibly the cause of it, and she was not terrified anymore of any strange dream or dreams. Fast forward to few years later, when Dorothy was about 15 years old, she would wake up in the middle of the night. Almost every night, she usually heard the voice of a man named Hora, who asked her to write down everything he said. She would then go into a trance, neither sleeping nor awake, and scribble notes in hieroglyphics. When she woke up, she had no idea what she had written, and it wasn't even her handwriting. Fast forward to a year later, of these recurring trances, she had 70 handwritten pages. And she was finally able to piece together that this was the story of her life in ancient Egypt, and this is a brief of the story as follows. She was an Egyptian woman named Bentreshite, born in the town of Abydos. She came from a humble background. Her father was a soldier who served during Seti I's reign, and her mother was a vegetable seller. By the time Bentreshite was 2 years old, her mother died of unknown cause, unable to care for Bentreshites anymore. After the death of her mother, her father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan, where she would be raised to become a priestess. Fast forward to 10 years later, when she was 12 years old, Bentreshite was given 2 choices. The first choice was that she could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own and start a new life elsewhere, and the second choice was pretty simple: become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Bentreshite decided to take the vows, and she stayed at the temple. A few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I, and with time things took a romantic turn, and they had an affair. After a while of having secret affairs with Pharaoh Seti, she discovered that she was pregnant with the child of the pharaoh. After several possible attempts to hide this shocking revelation, she had no choice but to tell the high priest about her relationship with Seti I. The high priest told her that her sin against Isis, an ancient Egyptian goddess, was so severe that she would be tried and likely sentenced to death. In order to protect the pharaoh reputation from such a dishonoring scandal, Bentreshite avoided the trial by taking her own life. Dorothy finally understood everything that was happening to her, and she could finally trace it back to her past life, 3,000 years ago. For the next few years, she worked at various jobs at a theater owned by her parents. In 1931, she got her big break when a position opened up in London, writing for an Egyptian public relations magazine. The 30s were a tricky time in Egypt, although it was officially declared independent from the United Kingdom. In 1922, the UK was still heavily involved in the governing of the country. Dorothy used her newfound position at the magazine to advocate for Egyptian nationalism and full independence. Throughout this period of her remarkable services in working for the magazine, she began corresponding with a wealthy Egyptian man named Ayman Abdul Magid, and things took a romantic turn, and they started dating. In 1933, Magid officially proposed to Dorothy, of which she accepted, and she was 27 years old at the time of her marriage. Finally, after her marriage to Magid, she traveled to Egypt for the first time in her life, and this was like a dream come true for her. She was completely overjoyed and basically over the moon. When she stepped off the boat in Cairo, she fell to her knees and kissed the ground. She wept and said, "I'm finally home," and if Dorothy Eady really was reincarnated now, she would have a better chance to prove it. Dorothy's marriage was off to a rocky start, and her husband's family was wealthy. But there was a problem. Her husband and his family didn't like how open and outspoken Dorothy was about her past life, and how she was more committed to Egyptian culture than her husband's family was. It was as if she was doing too much, and she needs to slow down. But Dorothy was unfazed by this, and as said earlier, she didn't care about how others thought or felt by her religion beliefs, and she wasn't concerned if they were offended because she was being outspoken about her past life. This would continue, and unfortunately, after a few years Dorothy and Magwood divorced, because Magwood and his family couldn't tolerate her anymore. But earlier, before they got divorced, she gave birth to his son, who she named Seti. Following the divorce, Dorothy Eady changed her name to Seti, which means mother of Seti. This is how women or mothers were known and referred to in ancient Egypt. In 1935, she took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities. She was the first woman ever hired, but she quickly made a name for herself as a respected scholar. She published essays and articles about ancient Egypt, and she also translated several documents in hieroglyphics, and even though Dorothy Eady had no formal training, she became known as an expert in the field. In 1952, Dorothy was finally able to take a job in Abydos, the town where she believed she had lived before. In Abydos, she became known as an eccentric by the locals, as she observed ancient Egyptian religion to the extreme. She usually walked barefooted everywhere, and she would spend her nights praying and sleeping in the Egyptian temples. In 1957, the new chief of antiquities wanted to test Dorothy. He admitted that she had an uncanny understanding about the ancient Egyptian culture, but he didn't really believe, and was kind of skeptical, that she lived in the Temple of Seti, thousands of years ago. So one fateful night, he escorted her to the temple. The only light they had was a torch. He then asked her to take him to different parts of the temple. At this point, nothing had been published about the layout of the temple, and Dorothy had never been there before in this her present life. But shockingly, Dorothy was easily able to guide him anywhere he asked to go. With no map and no light, she knew every inch of the temple. After his sixth attempt to stump her, he gave up and was convinced, although he was totally surprised. Also, another interesting fact was that one of her recurring dreams or memories depending on what she believed was of the gardens of the Temple of Seti, but those had not yet been discovered by archaeologists. Dorothy told scientists where to find the gardens, and when they excavated the exact location that she gave them, they found it. Also, she said if they dug on the north side of the temple in a specific spot, that they would find a hidden tunnel. Sure enough, the tunnel was found there. In 1964, she turned 60 years old, and by Egyptian law, she was supposed to retire. But not only was she the first woman hired by the Department of Antiquities, but she was also given special permission to keep working, because she was too valuable of a resource to let go. Egyptologists couldn't explain how this was possible, but she was able to make countless discoveries that was quite remarkable, just by remembering them. Although her specialty was the Temple of Seti I in Abydos, she did claim to have knowledge of other ancient Egyptian sites. For instance, when she said the lost tomb of Nefertiti was underneath the tomb of her stepson Tutankhamun. Dorothy made this shocking claim in 1972. Tutankhamun's tomb was found in 1922, and although the tomb had been studied for 50 years, there was no evidence of a chamber there, until 2015 when radar imaging technologies show that there actually was a chamber, right where she said it would be, confirming her claims is 100% valid. Dorothy also said that there was a small library located underneath one of the feet of the Sphinx, stating that there's a room under the Sphinx. At first, nobody believes her as expected. But fortunately, fast forward to several years later, they decided to do a scan and they found out that she was right, and there was in fact a room down there. Most of her claims proved to be 100% accurate, although some skeptics would object to this later on. Based on forensic research, about 30 of Americans, including almost 25% of Christians, believe in reincarnation. Reincarnation might be fringe science or pseudoscience in the Western world, but in the East, reincarnation is viewed differently. It's a central part of Hinduism, Buddhism and Sikhism, and several other religions for about a quarter of the world's population, almost 2 billion people. Reincarnation is essential belief. The Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, is said to be the reincarnation of Pema Dorji, the first Dalai Lama who died in 1474. The current Dalai Lama, who was born in 1935, is the 14th incarnation of Pema Dorji. When the Dalai Lama dies, senior Tibetan monks conducted an elaborate search to find his next incarnation. This search involves consulting oracles, interpreting visions and reading spiritual signs. The senior monks may find clues from the deceased body of the Dalai Lama, such as the direction it faces. If the body is cremated, the direction of the smoke is monitored as a potential indicator for the direction of the rebirth. The current Dalai Lama was found at the age of 2, after a senior monk saw his village and house in a vision. The boy, then named Lama Thundup, was able to identify items that belonged to the previous Dalai Lama, including a drum used for rituals and a walking stick. The subject of reincarnation makes us believe that there's comfort in the thought that death is not the end, that the physical life is just a temporary experience meant to teach us lessons, to prepare us for our next life, or to prepare us for what comes after. Dorothy Eady's case remains one of the most compelling cases for reincarnation. There are some skeptics that claim that these might not be fully accurate, and it might not really be a piece of evidence. Skeptics will point out that while Dorothy Eady was able to identify many Egyptian tombs, tunnels and rooms, she also got plenty of things wrong, and some even believe that, when Dorothy hit her head falling down the stairs, she injured her brain, and this injury caused her to have foreign accent syndrome, which is a real thing, and that the injury also caused her to develop obsessive-compulsive disorder, with her obsession being ancient Egypt. Although there's no proof if she had really developed this obsession at 3 or 4 years old, but she would become very skilled and knowledgeable about the subject. It was known that Dorothy Eady was institutionalized multiple times for mental health issues. Also, all the stories about Dorothy's early life come from Dorothy herself, starting from the fall, her experience in the museum, the trance writing, the time she was tested in the darkness of the temple. There's no sort of evidence if any of this event ever happened. The skeptic's point of view, and even famous Egyptologists, who notoriously dislike anything mystical, said that Dorothy's knowledge of Egypt was beyond simple intuition, but it was uncanny now. They stopped disputing her claims and later agreed that she was reincarnated, but nobody denies her contributions to the study of ancient Egypt. Dorothy Eady has been called the patron saint of Egyptology. And also, amidst all the skeptics' claims, a 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. Dorothy Eady would live out her remaining years near Abydos, a few walking distance to the Seti's temple, and that was the place since childhood that she considered her home. After all these remarkable discoveries and contributions, she finally died of old age in 1981 in her true home, Egypt, just exactly as she had wanted. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end, you are much appreciated. Kindly like, subscribe, comment, share. What's your opinion on this? Kindly drop your comments below and also send your story suggestions to our email. Also check out our video sponsor for your health and nutrition. See you in the next video.